It's really important to talk about the New West, but don't forget, it's no coincidence that was the most racist time in American history, that era. It makes perfect sense that that racism we use to justify the conquest, the literal conquest of the last remaining area of the continental United States, that the U.S. is not fully taking the West. And this is by the end of Reconstruction, these are all territories, and part of the justification would be that racism. And so it fits in together at the same time. I think that's the reason why in the textbook they put the New South and the West together. Reconstruction ended, and here. And I put down the Gilded Age, and I'll explain that again, hopefully tomorrow.
There's also a new heading.
Yeah, so new heading, the West. And this area here, there were many different Plains Indian tribes, but by definition, the Plains Indian tribes were small because they're nomadic. Unlike the East, where there would be villages and cities, like Cahokia had maybe 500 to 100 or to a million people, 500,000. That's a big difference, 500 to a million. 500,000 to a million people in Cahokia when in the 1400s. Nomadic tribes, by definition, have to be small. Have to be small because they have to move to follow the food supply because it doesn't rain. This is that western area where they get less than 20 inches of rain a year or even fewer. Now, they would gather crops, but a lot of times they would grow crops like bottomlands along river. So they would plant or at least cultivate a little bit, then move, and then come back in the fall. And Plains tribes moved in the summer, hunkered down in the winter, I think for obvious reasons. And if you spent a wonderful winter in the northern Great Plains, you know how temperate and nice it is. If you don't believe me, go to North Dakota and hang out this month. Of course, it's going to be like that next week. It's going to be like that here. The average low, 1,000 below. And that's not even including the wind chill. Actually, I think anything below 20 below, what's the difference? 1,000 below. But there are a lot of gathering, a lot of hunting, but the main animal were the American bison. I put down buffalo, partially just to remind myself to say it again, because I was taught buffalo. You've all heard buffalo, but they're not buffalo. They're bison. Buffalo are in Asia and Africa. Bison are in the Americas. It's not a huge deal, but it still is, there is a difference. But I always call it that, so we just say it's the buffalo. And there were maybe 60 million bison on the Great Plains when Columbus arrived. Remember the big thing about Columbus arriving? That would trigger the globalization. What was that exchange of goods back and forth?
The triangle trade.
Well, that was triangle trade. That was another trade system, but the goods from the New World to the Old World and back. The exchange. The Columbian Exchange, yeah. And that's what spread the disease and globalization. And with that, that's why there's such a big shift. In fact, the number of bison would probably go up by a third by the middle of the 18th century. Why did the number of bison go up after Columbus arrived? Yeah, even though there weren't very many nomadic Indians, they keep their population down because they have to move. Still, disease ravaged them. Nothing like what's going to happen in the East. Because they're concentrated, there's so many more in the East. Just be devastated here. Really hurt, but there just weren't as many. And even though the bison were very important to be the reintroduction of the horse by the Spanish, that would also revolutionize hunting of the Great Plains, spread them out more. And so when the United States was actually moving into the Great Plains, that area was in flux. Because tribes that used to be relatively separate because of the horse are now coming into contact and conflict, which yes, the U.S. would take advantage of. I think I told you this before, but the horse is an American creature. And the same land bridge that probably brought humans over from, I have a map up there, but humans from Alaska and Siberia, horse went the other way. The humans who arrived in the Americas, well, they liked horse and ate them all. So they went extinct here, and then ironically, they ended up going to Europe and then coming all the way back. Who's had horse? Am I the only one who on the way to school sometimes we had no choice? Yeah, we had to stop and eat horse. He had no choice.
Off the side of the road.
I lived, and I'm not making this up, I lived 2 blocks from my high school. Halfway, yeah, you get hungry. No, I had horse once. You know what it tastes like? Horse. That's exactly right.
My brother ate it on pizza in Italy, and then he didn't know it was horse with me.
Oh, then you know. No, yeah, that's a good little surprise. I didn't friend, so that's okay. Who's had frog legs? Snail? Frog legs? Snail? Cricket? Rabbit? Salamander? Okay, that's guinea pig? All right, so.
Wait, why did it the black? Why did it like the black railroad is discriminated against just go west?
Well, a lot did.
Am I?
But remember, remember the laws. They couldn't leave their land because they're sharecroppers, and you can't just I'm going to go west and take off. You need money and for supplies and provisions.
Okay.
Just like today, you just can't move and go someplace.
But they even have any work.
But that's a very valid point, and a lot did. They worked on the railroads and stuff. So in the 20th century, you know what we call a cowboy. They didn't call them that then, but in the 20th century, almost half were probably descendants of slaves or former slaves.
Okay.
You know, they somehow got there, but not that many.
Okay.
But that's actually a good question. But think about the move, you need a lot of money regardless of the time. That's why when people today say, oh, there's jobs, why don't you just move and get the job? In Texas, you know how hard it is to move? If you've moved, you know. With that, this is the area of the Great Plains. And when we think of the West today, or you say the West, it's this area, partially because of all the myths of the 20th century. When the motion picture industry started at the beginning of the 20th century, all the way up to the 1970s, the most popular movies were Westerns. And there were stories about myths, but stories about this. For the first 30 years of television, or 20 years of television, into the 1970s, the most popular television shows, Westerns. In fact, the longest running primetime drama was a Western, a show called Gunsmoke. Has anyone ever heard of Gunsmoke? It's only has every Western stereotype in there. What's the longest primetime television show? You know? Well, besides 60 Minutes. You would know? The Simpsons. Which is actually pretty remarkable, because no one said a cartoon could make it in the late 80s. 1880s. That's when we started. Yeah, the 1980s. I can still vividly remember that because remember, I'm old. So back to this. So it's this conquest of the West, but we have to get to the big thing was this. Here's a very stereotypical, but it's from the 19th century, using horse to hunt bison. The bison were essential to the Plains tribes, essential. So they went hand in hand. I can't emphasize that enough. From their tools, using buffalo hide for teepees and shelter, to food, I mean, you name it, they needed the bison. And so they're totally dependent upon it. And there were probably still 40 million bison in 1850. Even though the numbers are starting to go down, I think you probably guess why. But the big thing was, during this era, most citizens of the United States were just going across here to get to the West Coast, California or Oregon, on the Oregon Trail, California cut off the Santa Fe Trail. And in 1851, in Fort Laramie, which is right here on the Oregon Trail, one of the few U.S. forts in the West at that time, if you go there, they try to make it like it's 1860 now. It's really cool. The problem is you have to go to this area of the country, which is, whew, that's a hard area to go through. Flat and dry. And has anyone been through there? Yeah, but the fort is really interesting. But they brought tribes from all the Great Plains. It must have been one of the most remarkable events in American history. Something that will never, ever be replicated, even close. And basically what the U.S. said is, the various tribes of these plains, you can have these lands. They kind of divvied them up forever. Just don't harass the wagon trains going westward. You know, kill a few of the bison for food along the way, but just let that go. And How long will that treaty last? To the US point of view. Actually, unlike the treaties in the East, that lasted a really long time, almost a decade, where the US totally, completely broke that treaty. The tribes were totally cheated. When they signed that treaty, they admitted they're part of the US, and that just so undercut their position. They didn't know that they were basically cheating themselves. So that's the Fort Laramie Treaty. And we're going to get to that back later. But the first real contact between the United States, or the first real conflict in the Great Plains, is going to be over mining. And it's not that the mines were in the plains. It's the impact of going over the plains, but one other thing, and you could probably guess, and the impact. And the first mines would be, well, this is pan mining, placer, hydraulic mining. Then I'm not going to, hard rock mining with the tunnels, and then now they literally just cut whole mountains today. But that's what they did in Last Chance Gulch. They hydraulic mined. Got water up as high as they could, then used pipes getting smaller and smaller as it went to get pressure, and just shot off the mountain, the sides of Last Chance Gulch. So it just took it all off. Nothing was left. And then they built Allen out of that. But this mining, and it'd be gold and silver. These dots right here are just gold mines. Every dot is a gold mine. Everyone now is a toxic dump, leaking all kinds of fun stuff into our water and soil and everything else to this day. Because remember, you dig this stuff out, it has mercury, arsenic, cyanide, all kinds of stuff in it. And they use cyanide in mining anyways. They inject it essentially. But the big thing was at first gold and silver. And the important thing to remember was this is the early 1860s. The United States needs gold and silver to pay the silver bill. It's almost a desperate need. So we're going to protect the miners. But then lead, zinc, nickel, other metals like that for steel, but copper was the biggie. The second industrial revolution is about ready to begin, and what's copper used for? Electrical wiring. And wherever there's silver, there's cotton. Did I say cotton? Copper. So Butte was a silver mine that went defunct, but then all of a sudden copper. So wherever there's silver, there's a copper mine, always. And the big first one was right here near present-day Reno, the Comstock Lode. In fact, a huge rush happened during the Civil War. In fact, Lincoln and the Republicans would hurry and make Nevada a state so they could get those electors in the election of 1864 because of people going to there. No other citizens of the U.S. even lived there. And then Colorado next. And Denver was already starting to be a commercial center, but then it would explode because of the mining. All the commerce coming in to feed the miners and all the equipment, and then the miners come to the mountains. And if you've been to Denver, you can understand why Denver would fall. It's really flat plains here, and then just a line of mountains. It's actually pretty spectacular. Just 5,000 feet and 10,000 foot line of mountains. So it makes sense that they would build a town there and all kind of funnel to Denver. By the way, right along that edge of the mountain is the biggest bison grazing ground in the United States. So the most important land for the Great Plains Indians. Then Montana during the 1860s. The miners came here. Yes, they're looking for gold, but the U.S. encouraged that because they needed gold to pay for the war. And the big thing is the miners come in, they tend to eat. Food. Where are you going to get food? The mining companies, the towns, people would send buffalo hunters out, and they would start slaughtering the bison by the thousands to feed the miners. So you combine more traffic through the Great Plains combined with the bison hunting, and there's a direct attack on the Plains Indians. Now, we're not going into more detail about the miners. Boom towns would form up. That's one thing we are desperately needing Western history class, because there's so much to cover in this, we can't go over it. But you can imagine the tribes here, especially as the mines exploded. I should add one more thing why this is such a big deal. Gold mines. Indian Territory. These joined the Confederacy. There was fighting in New Mexico between the United States and the Confederacy over New Mexico. It's close. It's close. This will come back. So that's one thing. Next, though, the railroad came at the exact same time. 1862, the Transcontinental Railroad Act was passed. 1862. Now, before we get to anything else, who was that guy, Mr. Whig, ran for president time after time, went to the American system of bank, tariffs, and internal improvements? Not, it's not Hamilton. Mr. Whig ran for president many times. He was Lincoln's political hero. Do you remember? From Kentucky. Maybe you said I didn't hear it. I heard Hamilton. Did anyone say Hamilton?
I said,
Was the way to say Clay?
yeah, well, yeah.
Oh, I didn't hear Clay. I'm so sorry. All I heard was Hamilton. Hey, it's tough. There's an acoustic shadow. Okay. Clay was Lincoln's political hero. Clay had been pushing for this, and now the South is gone, so they couldn't block it. So this is massive government aid for the railroads. Now, this is during the war. So they won't really be able to pick up construction until 66, 67, a couple years after the war. But this is going to go right through prime hunting ground. But this is massive government aid for business. Massive, unprecedented aid. And I'll come back for this. But this will set the trend to this very day. And it's going to be a twofold way. The first off are massive land grants. The United States is going to give away government land. When I mean federal government land, who owns that land? The people. The people own that land. It's the people's land. And supposedly the elected officials for the government are going to be the best caretakers for this land and distribute it best. Now let's be clear about it. The United States is stealing this land from the people who live there. Don't forget that. There's always a backstory. But the United States is going to give this land, the idea being not just like the land where the tracks are going, huge amounts, millions of square miles of land. Why? So they can sell that land and use it supposedly to pay for the railroads. Railroads are incredibly expensive. It has massive kind of expenditure. Do you remember that term for the means of production? What is that term? Capital. Huge capital expenditures. From just grading the tracks and surveying it to laying the tracks down to everything else. And so, land grants. See this map right here? This is a Democratic map 20 years after it. And it's attacking the Republicans for huge giveaways of the people's land to a few private companies who got unbelievably rich. Now, it's slightly exaggerated, but not by that much. I'll show you how. See that area dark right there? That was the land given away to the two railroads that built the Transcontinental. And then the next Transcontinentals, they doubled it. Look at the land they gave to the Northern Pacific. You are sitting on land that was given to the Northern Pacific Railroad. By the way, the Northern Pacific was Butte. That should give you an idea how much land they gave the railroads. And think about the value of that land. Land next to the railroad is going to be much more valuable than land far away. Just like today, land close to the main highway will be significantly more valuable than land far away, for the most part. Now, it's a huge giveaway, but it's not quite that. It's a checkerboard. It's every other 1 by 1 mile section. So railroads, don't say public land, railroad. So yes, it's huge, but it's not quite as big. So this is what we call a subsidy. This is a subsidy. Direct government aid to business. So they're taking the value of the people, us, and giving it to a few people. They're picking a company to get rich. And I should add this. For some reason, I wrote down checkerboard. I thought it was funny, and I left it up there. So the checkerboard pattern. So let's get back to this. They also gave them no interest, or I'm sorry, very low interest loans. Excuse me. Very low interest loans. And basically what I mean by that is basic free money. To build a business, especially a really big one, everyone has to borrow money. Well, this one, it's almost no interest. They get free money and they can pay it back whenever they want to the US government. And there's another thing. Do you remember that tenant farmers? And what was that? What was the collateral they had to put down? What did they call the collateral that the tenant farmers had to put down? Crop what? Lien. No lien. No collateral. They just get the money. Just imagine if you're starting a business and you're free money.
So what do they take away if they can't pay back? Nothing?
So the US government is basically saying, we're going to do whatever we can to make sure these railroads survive. And here's the point about this, and get this down. Because the US is going to get so much money in land grants and loans, they're basically saying these two companies and then other companies, no other companies, they pick two companies, are going to get richer than rich. They are so important, we will never let them fail. The United States will back them up. So even if they do stupid things, we will still make sure they survive. That is a massive government aid, massive subsidy. Now, we would never do that now to all the largest banks that destroyed the world's economy in 2008. The US government never would have given them a direct and indirect aid of $16 trillion. That never would happen today. So don't worry, sleep well tonight. As millions of people lost their homes, they got $16 trillion. Yeah, the point is, and why this history is important, it happened in the 1880s and it happens now. And this is what you have to get down. Jot this down, put an asterisk by it. That is why business leaders spend so much money to influence politics. That is why they spend so much money and put so many dollars into politics. And you can see it right now. President Trump's EPA is going to quit doing environmental testing for things like pipelines. They're just going to go. And who has given him millions of dollars to his campaign? Yeah, petroleum companies. They get something in return. They don't do it because we care about politics. No, they just don't want to pay for environmental protection. Pipelines all leak and they don't want to worry about it. So that happens right now and it happens then. They're intertwined. It doesn't have to be. We can say that's right or wrong. I'm not making a value judgment. That is what happens. But how much money they got? The amount of money is amazing. Take these numbers and multiply them by about 150, you get today's dollars. For a mile of track on relatively flat ground, it's $16,000 long. Here, $16,000 to build a mile of track. What's a foothill? You know what a foothill is, if I say that?
A little.
Kind of little hills. Can you define it?
No.
If you can, you get 32,000. Mountain, 48,000. And then 5 years after that, they would go back and retroactively double it and give them twice as much. That's free money. It's huge how much money they got from this. Massive amount of aid. Yeah, and they built the railroad. There's no doubt that this had economic effect. But at the same time, there was nothing that said they had to use this money to spend on the railroad or use the sale for this to spend on building the railroad. What else could they do? Give all the managers of the Union Pacific Railroad a 200% raise. Did they actually do that? Of course they did. Yeah, they just stole it and took it. In fact, the next Transcontinental Railroad were basically just, let's find a way to grab all this money and take it. I'll tell you about that one in a sec. But this railroad would be huge. And the first two Transcontinental Railroads, the Union Pacific coming from the east, from Omaha, and the Central Pacific coming from Sacramento, from Omaha and Sacramento. And what they did is, they were worried, rightfully, that if you just gave them mile per track, how would they make the track? If you're getting $60,000 to $48,000 per mile, How would you make the track if you just want to make as much money as possible? Like this. Wind it so you make more money instead of going straight. So to avoid it, at least for the first one, they didn't tell them where they would meet. They just said, go as fast as you can. So wherever you meet, you get as many miles as if you can push it, like the Union Pacific. The further west, the more money you get. The further east, the more money the Central Pacific gets. The other railroads, they wouldn't do that. And so we got the Union Pacific, Central Pacific. Now, the Central Pacific has some really high mountains, and this is a high plateau. But the head of the Union or the Central Pacific Railroad, a guy of this corporation, a new entity I'll tell you about on Friday or Monday, his name was Leland Stanford. And Stanford found a compliant geologist by the name of Josiah Whitney to say, foothills right here and this plateau are mountains. So he got significantly more money per mile. When Stanford, using his political influence to become the governor of California, would name the highest mountain peak in California after Josiah Whitney, which is the highest mountain peak in the continental United States, Mount Whitney. 14,800 feet, I think it is. And so that gives you an idea of the power of the money. And yes, Stanford will come back to him. So the race is on. And as soon as the war ended, it took a while to accumulate the material, and then they began to move. First, they surveyed it, and then they used grading crews to flatten it, and then build it as quickly as possible. And they're going right through the prime hunting ground, or the prime hunting ground for the tribes and the grazing ground for the American bison. So, look at Nebraska. Now, remember, this is a checkerboard pattern, but still, look at all that land that went to the railroad. It's just immense. It is just unreal. So, the Central Pacific Railroad, they wanted workers to come in. There weren't that many, especially most people did not want to go willingly go build a railroad, especially getting through the high Sierra Nevada mountains. It's up to 14,000 feet. How did you cut a tunnel through 14,000 feet in 1868? Lots of dynamite. Dynamite was just being invented. Nitroglycerin, was just being used, but it was so volatile, I didn't know what they were doing. So they used black powder, which might destabilize it. But then what do? You get men who hold a drill and a drill bit, hold it, and the guy with a sledgehammer, bang! And then you turn it, bang! Turn it. Volunteers for that job. And then when the mountains collapse, you bring new guys in and do it again. Thousands would die doing this. They contracted Chinese workers to come in. Chinese workers. Thousands of them. They weren't paid very much because the Chinese workers were kind of a little bit like the sharecroppers. They're almost owned by the landlords in China. They sold them to the United States. A lot of the Chinese immigrants who stayed ran away. Most of the Chinese immigrants who survived, and thousands would die, especially in the Sierra Nevadas, they went back to China. And I think you'll see why. You can imagine this was the most racist time in history. But they built it going westward. And then the Union Pacific also used immigrants and also former slaves. And they used so many Irish immigrants that they were generically called paddies. Paddies. And Irish immigrants. And so they would survey, grade to flatten as quickly as possible, and they'd throw ties down. They wouldn't even be very straight. They're just trying to build as quick as they can to get as much money as possible. Now, when they would put the actual rails down, they would hammer in at least 4 spikes, 2 on each side of the rail to make sure it's secured to the tie. By the end, they were nailing in both of them, 1 spike per tie. So they just rattled. In fact, over the next 5 years, they had to rebuild the whole thing. But it's a race to get as much money as possible. As much money as possible. And in fact, the grading crews passed each other. The Central Pacific Railroad in Utah went past the Union Pacific Railroad going the other way. And finally, President Grant came in 1869 and mandated that they will meet at Promontory Point, Utah. It's west of Logan, Utah. And they actually tried to make a little town there, but nothing's going to happen. Nothing's going to grow there because it's right here. North of the Great Salt Lake. It is the most desolate place I've ever been. There's salt flats and these dry mountains. It is just, has anyone been there? They have a great museum there. It's really a cool place, but whoa, you can see why no one's going to move there. And all the Park Service workers, because it's a national park, they live in Logan. But it was a big drunken party with the two railroad, the two trains met. So get my people right. Yeah, that's Leland Stanford. So Central Pacific, Union Pacific. And there's bottles all over. That's champagne, and these are glasses. And the plan was, in fact, they were going to pound in the 4 last spikes. It would be Grant would pound in one. Averell Harrington of the Union Pacific, Leland Stanford do the last one. Anyone know what the spikes were? One was silver, which had almost tap in it. One was gold, or gold and silver amalgamated. And then one was gold, but they really just had to actually pound a hole and tap it in because gold smushes. And then the last one was a regular iron spike. But it was connected to 2 lines of a telegraph. And the idea was when they connected, it would connect the line and send out a buzz to the West Coast and to the East Coast, triggering celebrations all over the United States. The Transcontinental Railroad was completed. This was a massive technological and unifying feat, especially after the horrible war. It was bringing the country together idea. But when they did this, here's a very stylized picture, and it shows Leland Stanford holding a sledgehammer right there. No. First off, has anyone ever tried to pound something in or split wood with a sledgehammer? It's really hard. Well, I meant for you people. For me, it's relatively easy. But for you people, no, sledgehammers are heavy. That's part of the whole gig. But you go like this, and if you can't like adjust it in mid, it goes and you miss. So it's hard to do unless you have a little bit of practice. But what's the other thing? Stanford was so drunk he could hardly stand up. They had to help him get the sledgehammer up. And he went and missed by a yard and fell and rolled over and no one hit it. But the telegraph operator pushed the button and connected the lines anyways. And this triggered huge celebrations and fireworks. The best was in Sacramento, where a big sign was unfurled saying California annexes the United States. We're all together now. Except for the people in the middle. And other transcontinentals would follow. If you get a chance, go there. This is my funny story when I was there. Of course, the gold and silver spikes are not there. I mean, they literally pounded them in and took them right out. And I think the silver and gold ones in the Railroad Museum in Sacramento, they have fake ones at the museum there. But when we were there, and there's this guy walking in, he had a bunch of little kids, I don't know, 40 or 50 kids with him. He had a big family. No, 4 or 5 kids. But you can just tell, like, we were driving with these little kids. And they go see if you can find the gold spike. And they just take off onto the track. And he's like, I'll take care of them for a while. I'll never forget that. I just thought, lesson 1 apparent. Okay, so with that, here's Leland Stanford. And Stanford was the president. This shows this marriage of business and government. He becomes the head of the Central Pacific Railroad, and they become the incredibly business-friendly governor of California. In fact, California was one of the most business-friendly and economically very conservative states in the Union, very Republican, up until the 1990s, and then it made a 180-degree shift. If you follow politics today, which you better, or somebody else will follow it for you, California is now reliably Democratic, but not then, not all the way up to the 1990s. And Stanford got rich mostly because of government aid. Didn't mean he didn't work hard, but boy, did he rake it in. He kind of felt guilty, and like a lot of people who made money in this era, what did he do to try to make his reputation a little better? He started a college and named it after himself so people would think, oh, isn't he a nice person in starting a college? And not this, what we'll call later, robber baron who stole public money to get rich. Vanderbilt, have you heard of that? There's a lot of colleges, a lot of private colleges like that, almost all of them, actually. So with that, yes, Carol, started by a bunch of the copper magnets in Montana. So with that, soon you had other transcontinentals, Northern Pacific, Santa Fe, Southern Pacific, and railroads would become to dominate and control the country. And this map gives you a classic example of the power of the railroads. I mean, they could make or break towns. Why do you think Seattle's big? This little town called Seattle bribed the leadership of the Northern Pacific Railroad to have it go there and not Tacoma. That's why Seattle's big. What are these? Colors represent what? Time zones. Why are there time zones? Because the railroad said there'd be time zones. And now we have time zones. That's why. That gives you the idea of the power. They could control time and space, literally. We'll come back to that later. With this, the very first immigration restriction law in American history would happen because of the railroads. Mass prejudice against Chinese Americans who came in and built the railroad for people, then they wanted to kick them out. 1884, banning or limiting Chinese immigration. The one on the left is pretty self-explanatory. Oh, what was that feeling? Anti-immigrant feeling? What's that called again? You remember? Begins with an N. What's it again? No Nothings was the party. Good. That's really good. Nativists. And their party was the No Nothings. And here, okay, yesterday for very good reasons we focus on the descendants of slaves, but this was a very racist, prejudiced time. So who's that in the middle? Who's that? Being eaten. That's Uncle Sam. So that's the U.S. and who's eating? That's Chinese. Who does that represent? Irish. And they ate real America, and then what happens to the Irish? See, they got the hat on, and you got ate by the Chinese. But the problem is that's what immigrants will do instead, unless we stop them. Intensely racist.
What did this act do?
Kept out Chinese immigrants. Limited them. It's more complex and kept them out. The United States, for the first 120 years, or 110 years, was open to everybody, even though there's a lot of nativists feeling. So, one man we have to get, and that's James J. Hill. He, unlike the other railroads, he started one based on the business model of corporations, which we'll get to more on Monday, but he built the Great Northern Railroad. In fact, the railroad, he did it through investment, and he was a ruthless. Ruthless is not strong enough of a word, businessman. So I'm not saying that he's noble, but he did it outside of the way other railroads do it. In fact, he did it in such a way they called it the Empire Builder. In fact, to this day, the legacy remains. The U.S. nationalized public passenger system, Amtrak, they call that Northern Line the Empire Builder, after him. And this railroad, the Great Northern, went from Chicago, and the main route went across the High Line of Montana to Seattle and then down to Portland. And this railroad, this one actually made it. To this day, it's still here. And much bigger.
That's the one that goes to Glasgow, right?
Yeah.
Farther north. No.
It was great, but I'll tell you in a second what happened to the rest of it. But the railroad's so powerful that why do you think there's Glacier National Park? Hill wanted people to take his passenger trains, and that's why there's Glacier. He did that. And that gives you an idea of the power of the Great Northern. And why was it such a big deal? They did not take land grants. They didn't take the land grants. So the Northern Pacific took massive land grants. And by the way, that track just meanders. The Northern Pacific, they didn't take land grants. And anybody want to guess what happened to the Northern Pacific Railroad? The people who started that railroad, they took the money from the land grants and the loans, and what did they do? Pocketed it all. And what happened to the railroad? Okay, you know the term bankrupt? Back then they would say receivership. It went into receivership 4 times in 10 years. And Hill just bought it. Hill bought it. Hill bought the Great Northern, or bought the Northern Pacific. He bought another railroad called the Burlington Route. And eventually they would unify into what's called the Burlington Northern. And then the Burlington Northern would buy the Santa Fe, and now that's the big railroad monopoly in this area, the Burlington Northern Santa Fe. And it starts from James Hill's Great Northern. It's the only railroad in Montana. Well, the Union Pacific goes into Billings, I guess. Montana Rail Link's a subsidiary.
What is the second one? Because of Seattle and.
Portland. So the land grants, this is just a way to steal money from the people. But here's the thing. Here's a train. This is supposed to be a very stylized watercolor of the this is Union Pacific. This is going through Wyoming. And this is all the story you go through, and guys would shoot out the window at the animals because it's alive, bang, bang. And well, but not much. But shooting a bison. The railroad cut right through the center of the biggest bison migration line. In fact, the bison herds are going to divide in two. This would constitute the direct threat to the Plains Indians. This would also lead to the end, the horrific end to what's going to happen to the Plains tribes, the Plains Indian Wars. And generically, I put down 1860, and it ends quite awfully in 1890. The Plains Indian War. And here's the railroad, and it goes right through this line, and you have battles. And the first battles will be over the southern buffalo herd, and then the last battles, including the ones in Montana, will be over the northern buffalo herd. Now, there are other battles. I'm simplifying it. I can only pick a few for obvious reasons, but to give you an idea of what happened, and let's start with, so this is just the Montana area. All these areas here, these are forts, these are battles. Right here's a little place called Sand Creek. So let's start there. 1864, now the railroad's not yet built, but we have mining in the war. Sand Creek, this is in southwestern Colorado. And what's happening were, to feed the miners, buffalo hunters were slaughtering this herd, soon to become the southern herd, by the thousands. The tribes there, including the biggest, the Cheyenne, they began to fight back, and fight back hard. Now, there's many different bands of Cheyenne. And they had their allies, the Arapaho, and they were allied to the Lakota further north. But they fought back. How they fought back? They killed the buffalo hunters, or at least tried to drive them off. So what did the U.S. do? Remember, Civil War. Indian territory was in the Confederacy. They thought, we have to stop this. We got to keep the flow of gold going. So they sent well-armed cavalry, many were militia, but they're really well-armed, under a Colonel John Chivington. Chivington had some military training, he was also a businessman, and they tried to sweep through western or eastern Colorado. When did they attack? When the tribes weren't moving. So what time of year? And the plan was, and this is the strategy, this is why I mentioned in this battle, because this would become the prototype of how the United States would fight the Indian Wars. Attack just before sunup. And what would the goal be? Terror. How do you commit terror? Kill as many people as possible. Any age, kill them. And that was the strategy. The problem was, Chivington couldn't find any of these Cheyenne that were attacking. But he found a band of relatively peaceful Cheyenne. In fact, they were flying an American flag. The U.S. always looked for a male chief, and that's why they called it Black Kettle's encampment. You know, maybe 500 at most, maybe less. It's hard to tell exactly. But they had signed a paper saying they would actually protect buffalo hunters. There are very few people of military age there, so it's mostly young and elderly there. Chivington finally found Black Kettle's encampment, and even though they're flying an American flag, he figured, well, an Indian's an Indian. So what did they do? They got really drunk and then attacked just before sunup. Just before. And the orders were kill everybody 10 years and up. Kill them all. By the way, how do you know someone's 10? And not 6. So basically killed everyone this time. And when Chivington was asked, now wait a second, are we going to kill children? And Chivington's response was, nits make lice. What's a nit? The egg. The lice egg. So kill them when they're young. and they rode in and massacred hundreds. Over 200. The only reason they didn't kill more, they were so badly led and so drunken and disorganized that a significant number would escape. Remember, wait a sec, remember Blackhead. So I'll tell you one more thing that's going to happen to him. The same exact thing is going to happen to him 8 years later. Exactly. I mean, exactly. He won't make it that long. And this would become how the United States defeated the Plains Indians. Surprise attack, tear, kill as many as possible. Let me look at the list quickly. Don't mess with that spider. You want to graduate. It's just a floor. Yeah, the only thing is, okay, it says Democrat and Republicans. They call themselves Republicans, and we're just going to say Republicans. That's it. Everything else looks good. What's your question? Who asked the question?
I just answered it. Sorry, I got nothing to do.
You got it. All right, clear out, people. Now. I'll get it done. I'll get it done. Don't worry. I gotta find the Bugs Bunny cartoon. We're gonna watch in special topics. We're gonna watch Racketeer Rabbit, which is Bugs Bunny fighting mobsters, finished by organized crime unit. It's a great one. Why are you sending this to me, and why are you out to get me? Okay. You!